Hashtag they told me I couldn't afford the house, then I paid in cash and bought the whole street. The realtor looked at me like I was a cockroach that had crawled out from under her designer shoes, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming impatiently against the marble countertop of her downtown office. My worn jeans and faded jacket clearly didn't meet the standards of Blackwood Properties, the most exclusive real estate firm in the city, but I had come here for a reason that would soon make her regret every condescending glance. "Sir, I'm afraid the Willowbrook Street properties are simply out of your price range," she said, her voice dripping with practiced politeness that barely concealed her disdain. "The smallest house on that street starts at $12 million, and frankly, based on your current financial documentation, I don't think we can help you today." I smiled, reaching into my jacket pocket to pull out a simple black envelope, the kind that might contain a wedding invitation or funeral announcement, but what it held would change everything about this conversation and about my life in ways I couldn't yet imagine. "How about I pay cash for the entire street?" I said quietly, placing the envelope on her desk with the gentle precision of someone who had been planning this moment for exactly 17 years, 4 months, and 12 days, not that anyone was counting except me. The woman, whose nameplate read Sarah Blackwood in gold lettering, laughed a sound like breaking glass, but her expression changed when she opened the envelope and saw the bank transfer authorization for $450 million, all legally obtained through methods that would make her skin crawl if she knew the truth. "This must be some kind of joke," she whispered, but her hands were shaking as she held the document, and I could see the exact moment when she realized that the numbers were real, that the signatures were genuine, and that the quiet man sitting across from her was about to become the most powerful person in her professional world. "No joke," I replied, leaning back in the leather chair that had probably cost more than most people's cars. "I want every house on Willowbrook Street, from number 1 to number 47, and I want them by the end of the week, but first, let me tell you why I'm really here, because this isn't about real estate, and it never was." Sarah's face had gone pale, and she was frantically typing on her computer, probably verifying the bank information, but what she would find would only confirm that David Chen, the man she had dismissed moments earlier, was now her most important client, though she had no idea that David Chen had been dead for 3 years. The real story began in a basement laboratory 17 years ago, when I was still known by my birth name, Marcus Sullivan, and I was working on a project that would either save humanity or destroy it, depending on who you asked and whether they knew what we were really creating in the underground facility beneath the university. Dr. Elizabeth Thorne had been my research partner, my closest friend, and eventually the woman I loved more than life itself, but she was also the reason I was sitting in this office today, preparing to unravel a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate power. "The houses on Willowbrook Street aren't just houses," I continued, watching Sarah's fingers freeze over her keyboard as the implications of what I was saying began to sink in. "They're cover stories, safe houses, and secret laboratories for an organization that calls itself the Meridian Group, and every person living on that street is either a scientist, a spy, or someone who knows too much about what happened to my research 17 years ago." The color drained completely from Sarah's face, and I knew I had her attention now, knew that she was beginning to understand that this wasn't a real estate transaction but the opening move in a game of chess that had been 17 years in the making. "You see, Sarah, and I hope you don't mind me using your first name, but we're going to be working very closely together over the next few days. The Meridian Group stole my research, killed my partner, and tried to kill me, but they made one crucial mistake. They underestimated how far a man will go for revenge when he has unlimited resources and absolutely nothing left to lose. The research had been theoretical at first, a way to manipulate quantum fields to create what we called temporal pockets, small bubbles of spacetime where the normal rules of physics didn't apply, but Elizabeth had discovered something that changed everything, something that made our work incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous. "Sir, I think perhaps we should involve the police," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, but I could see she was already calculating how much commission she would make from a $450 million sale, and greed was winning the battle against common sense. "The police can't help us," I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the city where I had spent the last 3 years planning this moment. 3 of the current residents of Willowbrook Street are former FBI agents, 2 are retired CIA operatives, 1 is a federal judge, and the rest are scientists and researchers who have been working on applications of my stolen research, applications that could reshape the global balance of power if they fell into the wrong hands. The truth was more complicated than that, because the Meridian Group wasn't just stealing research, they were stealing time itself, using my theoretical work to create temporal manipulation devices that could alter past events, change the outcome of elections, prevent disasters or cause them, and fundamentally reshape reality to serve their purposes. Elizabeth had discovered their plans 3 years ago, and they had killed her for it, making it look like a car accident, but not before she had managed to hide copies of all our research and evidence of the Meridian Group's activities in a place where only I would think to look. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the resignation in her voice as she realized that her normal Tuesday morning had just become the most dangerous day of her life. "I want you to process the sale, transfer the properties to my shell companies, and then I want you to disappear for about a month while I clean house," I said, turning back to face her with a smile that I hoped looked more reassuring than threatening. "After that, you'll be the richest real estate agent in the city, and all you have to do is pretend this conversation never happened." But Sarah was smarter than I had given her credit for, and she was already putting pieces together that I hadn't expected her to figure out so quickly. "David Chen died 3 years ago," she said, her eyes narrow with suspicion and fear. "I remember the obituary because he was a respected physicist, killed in the same car accident as Dr. Elizabeth Thorne. So who are you really, and why are you using a dead man's identity?" The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon, and I realized that my carefully constructed plan was already beginning to unravel in ways I hadn't anticipated, but perhaps that was for the best, because the truth was always more convincing than any lie I could tell. "You're absolutely right," I said, settling back into my chair with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in his head. "David Chen did die 3 years ago, in the same accident that was supposed to kill me, but what you don't know is that David Chen was my research assistant, my student, and my friend, and when the Meridian Group decided to eliminate everyone connected to our research, they made a mistaken identification that saved my life and gave me the perfect cover identity. The car accident had been carefully orchestrated, a collision at a remote intersection during a thunderstorm, designed to look like tragic bad luck, but the Meridian Group's assassins had switched our identities in their planning, expecting Marcus Sullivan to be driving David's car and David Chen to be in my laboratory that night. Instead, I had been in David's apartment, trying to decode Elizabeth's final message, while David had gone to the lab to collect some equipment we thought we might need. And when the explosion destroyed the building 12 minutes after the car accident, the investigators assumed that Marcus Sullivan had died in the lab fire while David Chen had died on the highway. "So Marcus Sullivan is supposed to be dead too," Sarah said, and I could see her mind working, processing the implications, calculating risks and opportunities with the cold efficiency of someone who had built a successful business by reading people and situations correctly. "Marcus Sullivan is dead," I confirmed. "The man sitting across from you now is someone else entirely, someone who has spent 3 years learning everything there is to know about the Meridian Group, about their operations, about their personnel, and about their plans for the research they stole from Elizabeth and me." The research itself was elegantly simple in theory but catastrophically complex in application, based on the principle that consciousness could be used to collapse quantum wave functions in specific ways, creating localized alterations in spacetime that could affect causality within carefully defined parameters. What we had discovered, what Elizabeth had died for, was that these temporal manipulations were cumulative, that small changes could be layered on top of each other to create massive alterations in historical outcomes, and that someone with enough resources and knowledge could literally rewrite history to suit their purposes. "The Meridian Group has been using our research for 3 years, I continued, watching Sarah's face as the full horror of the situation began to dawn on her. "They prevented terrorist attacks that would have exposed their operations, eliminated witnesses who might have testified against them, changed the outcomes of stock market fluctuations to fund their activities, and influenced political events in ways that have reshaped the global power structure. But they had made mistakes, small ones that individually meant nothing but collectively painted a picture of an organization that was growing too confident in their abilities and too careless with their security, and I had been documenting every single one of those mistakes. "You're completely insane," Sarah said, but there was no conviction in her voice, only the desperate hope that I was a lunatic with too much money rather than someone telling her a truth that would change everything she thought she knew about the world. 3 weeks ago, the Meridian Group prevented a plane crash that would have killed 237 people, I said, pulling out my phone to show her a series of photographs and documents. The crash was supposed to happen because the pilot was going to discover evidence of their money laundering operations, but instead of letting him die and covering up the evidence, they saved the plane and eliminated the pilot 3 days later in what looked like a heart attack. The photographs showed flight records, medical reports, and security camera footage that told a story of systematic murder disguised as accident prevention, and I could see Sarah's worldview cracking like thin ice under pressure. Last month, they influenced the outcome of a Senate election by preventing a scandal that would have destroyed their candidate's campaign, I continued, scrolling through more evidence on my phone. They went back and eliminated the witness who would have come forward, changed the timing of a police raid, and altered the sequence of events so that their candidate appeared to be a hero instead of a criminal. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also completely impossible to prove through normal channels, because the Meridian Group controlled key positions in law enforcement, the media, and the judicial system, which was why I needed to take a more direct approach. "Even if this is all true," Sarah said, her voice shaking now, "what makes you think you can stop them, and why do you need to buy Willowbrook Street to do it?" "Because Willowbrook Street is their command center," I replied, putting my phone away and leaning forward with the intensity of someone who has been planning this moment for years. "Every house on that street contains part of their temporal manipulation network, a series of quantum field generators that work together to create large-scale alterations in the timeline, and if I can control those generators, I can undo everything they've done and expose them for what they really are." The plan was more complex than that, involving years of preparation, the creation of multiple shell companies, the accumulation of vast resources through carefully orchestrated investments, and the patient assembly of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or cover up, but the core strategy was simple: take control of their own weapons and turn them against their creators. "You want to use their time manipulation technology against them," Sarah said, and I was impressed by how quickly she had grasped the essential elements of the situation. "I want to create a temporal paradox that will unravel every change they've made to the timeline," I corrected. "I want to restore the original sequence of events, bring back the people they've killed, prevent the disasters they've caused, and expose their organization to the world in a way that can't be covered up or explained away." But there was more to it than that, because I had spent 3 years not just planning revenge but developing improvements to the original research, enhancements that would make the temporal manipulations more precise, more powerful, and more permanent than anything the Meridian Group had achieved. "This is absolutely insane," Sarah repeated, but she was already reaching for her phone, already calling her assistants to begin the paperwork for the largest real estate transaction in the city's history. "Insanity is letting them continue to reshape reality for their own benefit while the rest of humanity lives in a false timeline where none of us can trust our own memories or experiences," I said, standing up again and extending my hand to seal our agreement. "Sanity is fighting back with every resource at your disposal, even if it means risking everything you have and everything you are." Sarah looked at my outstretched hand for a long moment, and I could see her weighing the risks against the potential rewards, calculating the odds of survival against the certainty of becoming complicit in something that was either the most important mission in human history or the delusions of a madman with unlimited funds. "If you're right about any of this," she said finally, taking my hand with fingers that were cold as ice, "then we're all already dead, and the only question is whether we die fighting or die hiding." "That's the most intelligent thing anyone has said to me in 3 years, I replied, shaking her hand with the firm grip of someone sealing a pact that would determine the fate of reality itself. The next 6 hours were a blur of legal documents, bank transfers, shell company formations, and carefully orchestrated property acquisitions that moved so quickly that even the Meridian Group's monitoring systems couldn't keep pace with the changes. By sunset, I owned 47 houses, 3 commercial buildings, a small park, and 2 city blocks of the most exclusive residential area in the city, but more importantly, I owned the physical infrastructure of an organization that had been manipulating time itself for their own benefit. The first sign that the Meridian Group had noticed my activities came at exactly 11:47 p.m., when every light on Willowbrook Street went out simultaneously, followed by a power surge that should have been impossible with the city's electrical grid, but which made perfect sense if someone was trying to activate quantum field generators in a pattern that hadn't been used for over a year. I was standing in the master bedroom of house number 23, the geographical center of their operation, when the temporal distortion began, a subtle shift in the air pressure and light frequency that most people would dismiss as imagination but which I recognized as the signature of active chronological manipulation. "They know you're here," Sarah said, her voice coming through the earpiece I had given her before sending her to monitor the situation from a safe distance. "I'm seeing movement in at least 6 of the houses, and there are vehicles approaching from both ends of the street." "Let them come," I replied, opening the briefcase I had brought with me and beginning to assemble the device that would either save the world or destroy it, depending on whether my calculations were correct and whether Elizabeth's final message had given me the key to controlling temporal paradoxes without causing reality to collapse entirely. The device looked deceptively simple, a collection of quantum processors, field generators, and consciousness interface modules that could fit in a briefcase but contained enough processing power to simulate entire universes, and more importantly, enough precision to target specific moments in the timeline without creating cascading changes that could unravel causality itself. "Marcus," Sarah's voice crackled through the earpiece, and I noticed that she had stopped using my assumed name, a sign that we had moved beyond pretense into the realm of absolute truth. "There are at least 20 people surrounding the house, and they're carrying equipment that looks like the kind of thing you might see in a science fiction movie." "Temporal stabilizers," I said, connecting the final components of my device and feeling the familiar hum of quantum fields coming online. "They're trying to create a localized chronological anchor that will prevent me from making any changes to the timeline, but they don't understand that I'm not trying to change the past, I'm trying to restore it." The distinction was crucial, because changing the past required fighting against the natural flow of causality, while restoring the original timeline meant working with the universe's inherent tendency toward chronological stability, a principle that the Meridian Group had never fully grasped in their arrogant manipulation of temporal mechanics. "They're moving toward the house," Sarah reported, her voice tight with fear and adrenaline. "You need to do whatever you're planning to do right now, because I don't think they're planning to negotiate." I activated the device, feeling the familiar sensation of consciousness expanding beyond the normal boundaries of space and time, touching the quantum foam that underlies reality and searching for the specific moments where the Meridian Group had made their changes to the timeline. The first alteration I found was Elizabeth's death, not the car accident itself but the series of small changes that had led to her being on that highway at that exact moment. A cascade of manipulated coincidences that had guided her to her death like a spider guiding a fly into its web. Undoing that change required incredible precision, because Elizabeth's survival would create ripple effects throughout the timeline that could affect millions of people, but I had spent 3 years calculating those ripples, modeling their consequences, and preparing for exactly this moment. The second alteration was more complex, a series of prevented disasters and manufactured coincidences that had allowed the Meridian Group to accumulate power and resources while appearing to be heroes rather than criminals, but these changes had left signatures in the quantum foam, traces that could be followed and reversed if someone knew what to look for. "Marcus, they're in the house," Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now. "I can hear them moving through the lower floors, and there's something wrong with the air, like before a thunderstorm but worse." "Temporal interference," I said, my consciousness still partially extended into the quantum realm while my physical body remained seated at the device. "They're trying to create a localized time dilation field that will slow down my perceptions and give them time to stop me, but they don't realize that I'm already operating outside normal temporal boundaries." The third alteration was the most dangerous to undo, because it involved the research itself, the moment when the Meridian Group had first learned about our work and decided to steal it, but reversing that change would create a paradox that could potentially unravel the entire timeline if not handled with absolute precision. "They're on the second floor," Sarah reported, her voice now barely audible through the temporal distortion that was building around the house. "Marcus, whatever you're doing, please hurry, because I think they're about to do something that will make this whole area very unhealthy for human habitation." I found the moment I was looking for, the precise instant when Dr. James Morrison, the Meridian Group's lead researcher, had first read our published paper and realized its implications, and I began the delicate process of creating a causal loop that would prevent him from understanding the research while ensuring that Elizabeth and I would still develop it independently. The paradox was elegant in its simplicity. Morrison would dismiss our paper as theoretical nonsense, just as hundreds of other researchers had done, but Elizabeth and I would continue our work, eventually discovering the truth about temporal manipulation and the danger it represented, which would lead us to publish warnings that would prevent the Meridian Group from ever developing the technology in the first place. There at the door, Sarah whispered, and I could hear the fear in her voice despite the temporal distortion that was making communication increasingly difficult. "Tell them that Marcus Sullivan says hello," I said, initiating the final sequence that would collapse the quantum wave functions and restore the original timeline. "And tell them that Elizabeth Thorne sends her regards." The device reached critical resonance at exactly the moment when the Meridian Group's operatives broke down the door to the master bedroom, and I had just enough time to see their faces change from confidence to confusion to absolute terror as they realized what was happening to their carefully constructed alternate reality. The temporal wave propagated outward from Willowbrook Street at the speed of causality itself, unraveling 3 years of alterations and manipulations, restoring prevented deaths and undoing manufactured miracles, returning the world to the timeline where Elizabeth Thorne was alive and the Meridian Group had never existed. I felt my consciousness snap back to my physical body like a rubber band, and suddenly I was standing in a different room, in a different house, on a different street, because the Willowbrook Street that I had just purchased had never been built, and the houses that had contained the Meridian Group's equipment had never been designed or constructed. Instead, I was standing in Elizabeth's laboratory, the same underground facility where we had conducted our research 4 years ago, and she was sitting at her desk, alive and brilliant and beautiful, looking up at me with concern and confusion because I had just appeared out of nowhere with tears streaming down my face. "Marcus, are you all right?" she asked, standing up and moving toward me with the careful movements of someone approaching a person who might be having a mental breakdown. "You look like you've seen a ghost, and why are you wearing clothes I've never seen before?" "Because I just saved your life," I said, pulling her into my arms and holding her with the desperate intensity of someone who had spent 3 years believing that the most important person in his world was gone forever. "And because I love you more than time itself, which is something I never got the chance to tell you before you died." Elizabeth looked at me with the expression of someone trying to solve a complex equation in her head, and I could see her brilliant mind working through the implications of what I had just said, considering possibilities that most people would dismiss as impossible but which she would recognize as theoretically sound. "Marcus," she said carefully, "what year do you think it is?" "It's the year when I finally get to tell you that I've figured out how to make our research work," I replied, "and it's the year when we publish papers that will prevent anyone from using temporal manipulation for evil purposes, and it's the year when I stop being an idiot and ask you to marry me before someone tries to kill us both." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing everything I had said, correlating it with her own research and her own understanding of temporal mechanics, and slowly coming to the conclusion that I was either completely insane or telling her a truth that was more incredible than any fiction. "Show me," she said finally, stepping back and gesturing toward the equipment that filled our laboratory. "If you've really traveled back from an alternate timeline, if you've really undone 3 years of changes that I don't remember happening, then show me the proof, show me the research, show me everything." And so I did, spending the next 18 hours explaining everything that had happened in the timeline that no longer existed, showing her the enhanced theoretical framework I had developed, demonstrating the improvements to our original research, and proving to her satisfaction that I had indeed traveled back from a future that had been erased from existence. "This is the most romantic thing anyone has ever done for me," she said finally, when I had finished explaining how I had spent 3 years planning her rescue from a death that had never happened. "You literally rewrote reality to save my life and tell me that you love me, which is either the sweetest gesture in the history of human relationships or the most elaborate psychotic break ever documented." "Probably both," I admitted, pulling her close again and marveling at the simple miracle of her being alive and warm and real. "But I'd do it again in a heartbeat, because some things are more important than the stability of spacetime itself." We were married 6 months later, in a small ceremony attended by friends and colleagues who had no idea that they were celebrating the successful completion of the most complex rescue mission in the history of human existence, and we published our research with safeguards and warnings that would prevent anyone from developing temporal manipulation technology without understanding its dangers. The Meridian Group never existed in this timeline, their members instead becoming ordinary people with ordinary lives, free from the corruption and arrogance that had driven them to try to reshape reality for their own benefit, and the world continued along its natural course without the artificial manipulations that had once threatened to tear apart the fabric of causality itself. Sarah Blackwood became one of the most successful real estate agents in the city through entirely legitimate means, never knowing that in another timeline she had helped save the world by processing the sale of 47 houses that had never been built, and she occasionally wondered why she sometimes had dreams about a quiet man with sad eyes who thanked her for her courage in the face of impossible circumstances. Elizabeth and I continued our research, but we focused on the theoretical aspects rather than practical applications, publishing papers that advanced human understanding of temporal mechanics while carefully avoiding any work that could be weaponized or misused, and we established a foundation that monitored scientific research around the world for signs of dangerous temporal experimentation. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would wonder about the other timeline, about the people who had lived and died in that altered reality, about whether their experiences had been real or just echoes of changes that had never truly happened, but Elizabeth would remind me that reality is what we make of it, and that we had chosen to make a reality where love was more important than power. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked me one evening as we sat in our garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that existed in both timelines and in neither. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had chosen differently, if you had used the temporal manipulation technology for something other than rescue and restoration?" "Never," I said, taking her hand and feeling the solid reality of her fingers intertwined with mine. "Because this is the timeline where you're alive, where we're together, where the world is whole and unmanipulated and real, and no amount of power or knowledge or control over time itself could be worth more than that." She smiled, and I knew that she understood not just the scientific principles behind what I had done but the emotional truth that had driven me to risk everything for the chance to save the woman I loved, and we sat together in comfortable silence as the stars appeared in a sky that belonged to the one true timeline where love had conquered time itself. The story of the houses on Willowbrook Street became a legend in our family, a tale we would tell our children and grandchildren about the time when their father had told a real estate agent that he couldn't afford a house and then bought an entire street to prove a point, though we always left out the parts about temporal manipulation and alternate realities and the organization that had tried to reshape the world for their own benefit. Because some stories are too dangerous to tell in their entirety, and some truths are too powerful to share with people who aren't ready to understand the full implications of what it means when someone says they would literally move heaven and earth and time itself for love. But we kept the documentation, the evidence, the research notes and temporal calculations and quantum field specifications, locked away in a vault that only Elizabeth and I could access, because we knew that someday, someone else might need to know how to undo the kinds of changes that the Meridian Group had made, and we wanted to be sure that the knowledge would be available to the right person at the right time. Years later, when we were old and gray and our children had children of their own, Elizabeth would sometimes joke that I had gotten the bargain of several lifetimes when I bought those houses, because 47 pieces of real estate was a small price to pay for saving the world and winning the heart of the most brilliant woman in any timeline. And I would always reply that she was wrong, because the real bargain had been finding someone worth saving the world for, someone whose life was more precious than all the power and knowledge and temporal manipulation technology that had ever existed or ever would exist. The houses on Willowbrook Street were never built in our timeline, but sometimes when I drive through that part of the city, I can almost see them, ghost images of buildings that existed in another reality, sheltering people who lived different lives and made different choices. And I wonder if somewhere in the quantum foam that underlies all existence, those other versions of ourselves are still living and loving and fighting for the things that matter most. But then I come home to Elizabeth, to the woman whose life I saved by purchasing houses that never existed with money I earned through methods that never happened, and I remember that reality is not about what might have been or could have been, but about what is, here and now, in this moment and this timeline where love conquered time and truth conquered power. And that, I think, is the most important lesson from the whole incredible adventure, that sometimes the most extraordinary thing you can do is choose the ordinary miracle of love over the extraordinary power to reshape reality itself, because in the end, what makes life worth living is not the ability to change the world, but the presence of someone who makes the world worth preserving exactly as it is. The realtor never did get her commission on the sale of Willowbrook Street, because the street never existed, but Sarah Blackwood prospered in ways she never could have imagined, and sometimes when she sold a house to young couples just starting their lives together, she would remember a dream about a man who had bought an entire neighborhood just to prove that love could conquer anything, including time itself. And in the quiet moments between one showing and the next, she would smile and wonder if somewhere in the vast complexity of the universe, there were other realities where impossible things happened every day, where people bought streets and saved timelines and chose love over power, because even though she couldn't remember the details, something deep in her heart knew that such things were not only possible but necessary. Because the world needs people who will risk everything for love, who will challenge the impossible for the sake of those they care about, who will face down organizations and technologies and forces beyond human comprehension simply because someone they love is in danger, and who will choose the preservation of ordinary happiness over the acquisition of extraordinary power. That is the real story of the houses on Willowbrook Street, the tale of a man who was told he couldn't afford a single home and who responded by purchasing an entire neighborhood, not for the properties themselves but for the chance to save the woman he loved from a death that had already happened in a timeline that would never be. And if that seems impossible, if it stretches the boundaries of what you're willing to believe about the nature of reality and the power of love and the lengths to which someone will go to protect the things that matter most, then perhaps you've never been in love with someone whose life was more important to you than your own existence, and perhaps you've never faced the choice between accepting loss and fighting the universe itself for one more chance. But if you have, if you know what it means to love someone so completely that their absence would unravel your entire sense of reality, then you understand exactly why I told that realtor that I couldn't afford the house, and why I paid in cash to buy the whole street, and why I would do it again without hesitation if Elizabeth ever needed saving from anything, anywhere, in any timeline or reality that has ever existed or ever will.